All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Canned Wines Part 2. Welcome back to the exciting world of canned wines. We're going to be talking today with some new information on the impact of SO2 for canned beverages. Today's webinar is co-hosted by Enartis and Cornell University. And just a quick reminder note that the event will be recorded and available later. So I'll just introduce myself. My name is Rachel Allison, so I'll be moderating today's webinar. I'm a PhD candidate working with Gavin Sachs in the Department of Food Science at Cornell. My research focuses on the stability of copper treatments and the development of hydrogen sulfide, both in bottle and in canned wines. I wanted to let everyone know that we'll be opening the Q&A feature for your questions at the end of after both speakers. So today, Gavin Sachs and Josh Kaushik will be speaking. We'll open the Q&A at the end, so be sure to jot down your questions and ready to ask them when both speakers are finished. So a quick introduction to today's talk will focus on the role of SO2 in the development of hydrogen sulfide in cans. We'll briefly be reviewing the anatomy of the aluminum can for wines, a bit of a follow-up to the last canned wine webinar. We'll talk about the typical activities of SO2 in wine, as well as we'll touch on some of the current research objectives in the Sachs lab. So we'd like to start off with a quick survey question, an introductory question to understand today's participants and their experience or interest in canned wines. Okay, just going to give it about 5 more seconds. Okay. So let's share the results. We can see that we have a wide variety of interest in today's talk. Some people, at least a quarter of people, are already making with canned wines, and another 10% are dabbling. And we definitely have some interest in people here just looking to broaden their understanding of this new packaging. Our second survey question is related more to people who have experience already with canning wine. So if you have canned white or rosé wines, we're interested in knowing about the instance of hydrogen sulfide and if you've ever had any issues with hydrogen sulfide forming in these canned products. And then the second question is related to the same concerns. If you have ever experienced any hydrogen sulfide forming in red wines. Okay, gonna end the voting here. So we do see that we're getting more of the incidence of these hydrogen sulfide off aromas developing in white and rosé wines, at least anecdotally from our participants. So we'd like to thank you for your answers to those questions. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce the first speaker. Gavin Sachs is a professor and associate chair in the Department of Food Science at Cornell University. Gavin Sachs' lab research centers around wine and grape flavor chemistry, including the development of sulfur-like off aromas during fermentation and after boiling, developing methods for rapid volatile analyses, novel processes for flavor and aroma concentration, and analyzing quality factors for grape breeding programs. Gavin, you can take it from here.
Thank you, Rachel. I'm going to assume that some, but not all of you were able to see the excellent webinar from about a month ago, and I'll make reference to some of the information that got brought up, but also assume that some people here did not see that webinar, and I will repeat some of the key points at some point, hopefully not be too redundant for those of you who've seen a previous webinar. So for those of you who are canning wine or considering canning wine or just curious, the questions that I suspect that you want answered from this talk are pretty specific, such as I have a couple different choices of liners. Which liner, which manufacturer should I use? I've got wines and I'm concerned they might have problems. What components of the wine might cause problems? I have this wine, I think I might have problems. What kind of shelf life can I get out of this? I am only prepared right now to answer these as very general questions. For example, I can talk to some people offline, but I can talk very generally about how the current generation of liners is better than the previous generation of liners, but not as good as BPA-based epoxies. Generally, what shelf life you can get, but what we're trying to get at with our current work is to be able to answer these questions more specifically. And so what I'm going to be sharing today is what we know right now and where we hope to get in the coming months or years so that we can answer these questions with more confidence. Okay, here's the obligatory slide whenever you're doing a canned wine talk where you have to show some figure that shows there's been a big increase in canned wine. Presumably, if you're here for this talk, you do not need a slide like this. But again, just to reiterate, canned wine is the fastest growing sector of wine packaging by far. It's also pretty easy to be the fastest growing when you start from next to nothing. One of the things that's interesting to see in New York State and elsewhere on the East Coast is as compared to some other packagings like Tetra Pak, bag-in-box, even screw caps, we would have a few people who would get interested and do it, sometimes do it for all their products. What I'm seeing more with canned wine is there's a few people specializing in it, but there's a lot of dabbling. A lot of people who are just curious or just doing one or two of their products in it. And that's really interesting. So even though it's still a small portion of the overall market, the number of wineries and for that matter, cideries that this is touching is much larger. Okay, so this is going to be similar to the information you saw last time. We call it an aluminum can. Really, it's a plastic bottle. On the inside of that can, you have aluminum, and if you have aluminum foil, you have aluminum, and on the outside, if it reacts with water or oxygen, it'll immediately form what's referred to as a passive layer of alumina. In a can, this is not, or it's not supposed to be directly in contact with the beverage. There is a thin micron scale thickness layer of a polymer. Historically, as in until the last 5 or 10 years, almost all of these liners have been based off of BPA, which is a type of epoxy. Now, most wineries and cideries are transitioning or have transitioned already to other types of liners, especially if they want to avoid the labeling requirements that California and some other places impose, and are using other types of epoxy that are BPA non-intent or acrylic or polyester. And if you want to see this liner, this is from Rachel Allison. Actually, if you squint and look at that can, you might even be able to see her reflection holding an iPhone in that concave mirror of a can side. You can etch away the side with strong acid or with caustic and reveal this very thin plastic bottle or plastic bag that's on the inside. That's about 100 times thinner than the thickness of a typical water bottle. And that's the environmental savings right there. So yes, you're using plastic, but you're using a lot less of that plastic. Okay, so if you pick up a textbook on packaging, and this is not just wine packaging, but just a general packaging textbook, they often classify the effects that packaging can have on a food or beverage into three big buckets. And the first two are not usually of great concern to cans, at least if things go as planned. One is degradation. These are going to be ordinary processes that would happen to the product in the absence of the package. So as an example, oxidation. Oxidation can be a problem with cans. That's not going to be the subject of this talk. But if you put a product into a can with high levels of oxygen, especially high levels of oxygen in the headspace, you can rapidly consume all of your SO2 and have an oxidized product within a month or less. Most canners, mobile canners, or canning operators will measure dissolved oxygen and try to measure headspace oxygen. Eric Wilkes from AWI mentioned the importance of doing this last week. We have a spreadsheet on our Cornell Enology Extension website of how you can do this with a simple probe. You can't use the Presens or Nomosense type patches, of course, because the can's not transparent. But even just with a plain old typical immersion dissolved oxygen probe, you can determine the amount of oxygen in the headspace with the right protocol, as well as the oxygen in the liquid itself. Okay, so oxidation hopefully is not a problem. Once that product is into a can, it's a near hermetic seal. There's been some work in the brewing industry looking at how much oxygen gets into a can. It's irrelevant as compared to a typical lifespan of a product in a can. It could go for decades without having oxidation issues. Scalping. This would be absorption of flavor compounds, especially odorants, into the can liner. There's been no formal work on this in wine. There has been work in beer and other carbonated beverages. We would expect to see the most nonpolar compounds in wine, and particularly TCA, cork taint, getting absorbed. If there's any absorption, I think most of you probably wouldn't be too saddened if that was happening. But the liner is so thin that it will probably not be an issue for most of your products. Based on research that's been done with synthetic closures and loss of compounds, perhaps some flavorants that are added to other than standard products, or things like TDN, the petrol note of Riesling, possibly at risk for scalping, but probably of overall low concern. Tainting, however, this would be flavor changes due to reaction with packaging, or due to absorption from the packaging. So the packaging is directly contributing to the off flavor, usually in aroma. And this is going to be the subject of the rest of the talk. Because if you were here for last week's talk, or as was evidenced by Rachel's survey question, you are aware that canned wines can have a greater incidence, at least anecdotally, with hydrogen sulfide than the same wine stored in other types of packaging. So there's actually no formal peer-reviewed study that states this. We have an extension article that goes over this. But if you look back elsewhere in literature, for example, in the patent literature, up here, if you Google lawsuits related to off aromas and in this case, canned ciders, you can find that there is plenty of evidence online and elsewhere for the ability or for the proclivity of canned wines and ciders to develop hydrogen sulfide during storage, more so than other types of packaging. So what's also been known, this is a quick aside. I'm going to be talking about hydrogen sulfide measurements throughout the talk. Whenever we're talking about our own work, this is the approach that we use. I ordinarily don't put in details about analytical protocols into my talks because they're usually not too relevant to the discussion. But here, if you're interested in measuring and quantifying H2S in your winery, we've got a nice protocol that's appropriate for a small scale or mid-sized winery. You don't need a gas chromatograph or any kind of fancy detectors. You can modify an AO unit and blow the H2S out of the sample into an H2S detection tube. You have to scavenge out the SO2 so it doesn't interfere, but using an AO unit and taking around 10 minutes usually, you can get numbers for H2S below its sensory threshold, so down below parts per billion. And we should have an extension article coming out shortly on that topic. Okay. Okay. So there's a couple of sources of hydrogen sulfide that could be occurring in cans. One of these was reviewed by Eric and Neil from Australian Wine Research Institute last month in their webinar, which is that you can have release from odorless precursors under anoxic conditions. And these can happen under any kind of anoxic conditions, not just in cans. It could be in under a screw cap, it could be a sealed glass ampule, it could be under a good pepsicle or cork closure. A couple of these precursors are listed here. One is copper sulfide complexes, another is sulfides. If you would like to learn more about these precursors, then I suggest that you look at the previous webinar, which is available online. Josh, I can provide you more information about that. But what I'm going to be focusing on today is potential for tainting. That is new production of H2S, as opposed to release from H2S that was previously in the wine. And in this case, the wine is reacting with the aluminum, and specifically the SO2, we believe, is reacting with the aluminum to generate H2S. And so this reaction is pretty easy to demonstrate just using aluminum foil and solution, model wine solution containing SO2 or not. You, within a day's time, can have measurable H2S, as well as if you do this at neutral pH, you can start to see blisters. I think that Neil Schumgauer showed a picture like this last week. What this blister is, it's easier to see at neutral pH because it doesn't dissolve back into the wine. This is aluminum hydroxide formed due to corrosion of the aluminum, and it bursts up because that corrosion reaction will also produce hydrogen gas, and that will cause you get these little ruptures or blisters on the surface. So there's a couple of reactions that we know can be occurring between wine containing SO2 and aluminum. One is the reaction of aluminum with SO2 to generate H2S. Another is reaction of aluminum with either water or with protons to generate a hydrogen gas in either aluminum hydroxide or solubilized aluminum. The formation of dissolved aluminum is generally a factor of 100 or so greater from what we've seen, or maybe even 1,000-fold greater than what you get for H2S. The two are correlated. One of the reasons that this is important is that most approaches to measuring the suitability of a wine to be stored in a package are focusing only on this aspect of corrosion, the major reaction. And one of the things that we're trying to focus on is, well, what if what we care about is this reaction, the formation of H2S? Are these traditional approaches for measuring or predicting corrosivity as appropriate? Okay, and furthermore, this reaction of SO2 to yield H2S has been known for some time. This is your brief history lesson for the day. This is a report from what it's now the Journal of Food Science, where the authors dipped wine in, or I should say, dipped different pieces of metal into wine and observed the consequences. And if you look at what happens to aluminum alloys, you get hydrogen sulfide smells. And for those of you who know your wine history, you might recognize Lyman Cash's name from its eponymous Cash still as the middle author. Okay, so before I talk any further about aluminum SO2, I'm going to do a somewhat brief review on the chemistry of SO2. And I know most people on this call know plenty about SO2. You don't need to do this, but eventually I'm going to have a couple of surprises along the way. So to start from the beginning, when we talk about SO2 in wine, we're talking about several different species. If you add potassium metabisulfite to wine, most of it will quickly become bisulfite, HSO3-. Some of it will bind up to other compounds present in the wine, and some of it, depending on the pH, will form what's referred to as molecular SO2, or just plain old SO2, which is a neutral species. The sum of all of these species is referred to as total SO2. There's also sulfites, SO3 2-, but that's at negligible concentrations in wine. So we have three main buckets of SO2 to think about: molecular SO2, bisulfite, bound SO2. And at Wine pH, most of our SO2 is not actually SO2. If it's in the free form, it's mostly bisulfite. The higher the pH, the lower the proportion of molecular SO2. This is a talk for those of you in California scratching their heads. Can you have a pH under 3 in a wine? Yes, you can. We have Rieslings around here that occasionally are put in the package at 2.6, and their proportion of molecular SO2 is almost 10% of the pie. But typically, molecular SO2 is going to be more like 1 or 2% of the total bisulfite, total free SO2 pool. Okay, so basic review. The reason we care about these two different forms and why it's important to distinguish them is that they have different complementary roles in a wine. Molecular SO2 is primarily antimicrobial in a packaged wine. Typical ballpark recommendation is somewhere around 0.5, 0.8 milligrams per liter molecular SO2 to prevent spoilage of a broad range of spoilage organisms. And for free SO2, which is the major form, as bisulfite is the major form of SO2 in wine, free SO2 is present as an antioxidant. Typical recommendation for free SO2 is around 30 milligrams per liter, and it has a couple different functions, but its primary one is to react with and scavenge oxidation products. It doesn't react directly with oxygen, rather reacts with hydrogen peroxide, with aldehydes that can be formed during fermentation, with quinones that are a byproduct of oxidation. And if during the course of oxidation, free SO2 drops below around 5 to 10 milligrams per liter, this is usually the point where you start to notice oxidized aromas, especially in white wines. Okay. I'm going to skip this slide and instead talk about what happens as a wine oxidizes. You have this pool of bound SO2, and it serves as a reservoir for free SO2. So wine gets oxidized, free SO2 decreases, but then some of the bound SO2 can be released, which then replenishes the free SO2 pool. Once you get below around 10 milligrams per liter free SO2, you start to get release of some of these malodorous aldehydes. Acetaldehyde is the one that often gets the blame for off-aromas of oxidation, but it's some of these other really potent ones like methionine, smell like baked potato, and soy sauce that appear to be more important to this contribution. Okay, so this is the problem that was completely replacing SO2. We actually have decent options if you want to replace SO2's role as an antimicrobial. And I think Joshua will talk about some of them, and some of them you probably already utilize, like Velcorin or sterile filtration. For replacing free SO2 as an antioxidant, the other options, one option is you don't use SO2. That is going to make a certain style of wine. If your goal is to try to scavenge hydrogen peroxide, if your goal is to try to continue to bind up these aldehydic off aromas, there seems to be a limit to how far you can push a wine without having sensory changes to the wine. Okay, so this also brings us to that question that that Rachel asked about rosés and whites versus reds. In our experience, and it looks like people are seeing something similar, we often hear of winemakers who report rosés and whites having reduction or H2S. We very rarely hear about winemakers having issues with their reds. One could be that this is due to pH, and perhaps the molecular form of SO2 is more important, but there's something else beyond this that may explain why rosés and whites have fewer problems than reds. So we did some work, and this is actually a follow-up on studies that have been done decades ago, looking at what we call the distinction between true molecular or true free SO2 versus apparent free and apparent molecular. So when you use standard approaches, this would include flow injection or AO or Ripper for measuring SO2 in a wine, these do a good job with approximating how much truly free SO2 you have in whites and rosés. They grossly overestimate the amount of SO2 that's in your red wines. And this is because all of these methods involve an initial acidification and dilution step. And when you do that, you will very quickly dissociate your anthocyanin from their bound forms and release free SO2. So we find that almost all red wines have much lower free and much lower molecular SO2 than what your Ripper report or Ripper number or your flow injection analysis number or your AO number is saying. I think this is appreciated a little bit, but I'm not sure if you appreciate how much this is overestimated. That standard number you look at for free SO2 is too high by about a factor of 3, at least, and sometimes more than that. So we think this is the reason why reds have less of a problem. Most of your reds have very little free SO2, or at least very little true free SO2. Okay, so back to cans. Which form of SO2 is involved? And perhaps from a chemistry standpoint, how is this getting through the liner? And this is one of the things that we're currently investigating. We have this protective liner, and clearly somehow the SO2 either is bisulfite or molecular is circumventing it. Preliminary work from our lab indicates that this is probably due to molecular SO2. And we think this is because in most cases, bisulfite is not reaching the alumina or aluminum by direct contact due to pores or imperfections. Rather, we think the neutral SO2 is actually able to diffuse through this polymeric liner, and it does so more effectively through some of the non-BPA based liners. So we should have some more work forthcoming on that. This is one of several questions that we're looking into. We're also looking at whether other wine components exacerbate or mitigate hydrogen sulfide production. If you try to can your wine, if you've had that experience, you probably had this checklist of components that you're supposed to have in your wine or keep below for ethanol, for copper, for chloride. At least one canner or one can manufacturer has recommendations for tannins. Another has recommendations for acetic acid or for volatile acidity. This list goes on. There is very little data to back up these claims. There is almost no validation for most of these claims. Rather, it's based off of, in some cases, what's known from the brewing industry. In other cases, it's just well known that some of these compounds like chloride can corrode bare aluminum. This is known from the marine science. If you've got aluminum in salt water, it will corrode much faster. Copper can facilitate electrochemical reactions. It's unclear how important these are in a real can with a real liner. And to learn more about copper, I recommend you take a look at the other Enartis webinar. Eric Wilkes had some nice information on its potential role. Okay, and then another question, and this is what we really want to get to. Will this particular wine work with this particular can, this particular liner? The current tests that we have are often validated and well validated for overall corrosivity. So how much aluminum will leach out over time? It's not clear this always correlates with hydrogen sulfide production. And that's what we want to get to. We can see on the right, this is from our lab, same wine, 4 different cans, short time accelerated aging experiment. We can see big differences in hydrogen sulfide production. Why is that? Will that be consistent if we switch the wine? What we want is validated bench tests for hydrogen sulfide production, not just overall corrosivity. And what we're currently working on is, instead of having to rely on doing this in cans and with all the ambiguities that come along with cans, the canning process, seeing if we can do this with coated aluminum coupons. So I know this looks just like a piece of aluminum. That's aluminum with a can liner coated on all sides. And we've been able to work with some of the commercial liner producers to make these. And we're looking right now at incubation experiments where we put these in wine, short periods of time, higher temperatures, vary compositions, vary the wine, and validate against long-term storage experiments. So that brings me to my conclusion, which is that SO2 is widely used as both an antimicrobial and an antioxidant. It's very hard to completely replace the antioxidant role, although there are still ways to limit it. SO2 can make its way to the aluminum to make H2S, although we're still trying to figure out how that happens. We think that's through diffusion. That's our current hypothesis, but we still need to validate that. Practical recommendation right now, of all the things that you can consider, all that big list of copper and chloride and other things, the big one to focus on is, and that you can usually control, is your free SO2. If you're packaging with 30, because you've always packaged with 30, see if you can go lower. The recommendation I've been telling people is take 10, which is the floor you'd like to go to, find your total package oxygen, multiply times 4, add those all together. Why 4? Because 1 milligram per liter of oxygen will react with 4 milligrams per liter of SO2. So this seems like a reasonable place to target for the low end. And with that, so that you can have enough SO2 to avoid oxidized aromas appearing, but not so much that you won't get rapid H2S formation. And we are currently working on ways to do better validated short-term accelerated testing that can be useful in a production environment. And I think that wraps us up and gets us to acknowledgements, and will then be a transition to Joshua. Is that correct, Rachel? Whoops, I see Rachel is unmuting herself. And I think also you should hold your questions to the end. Rachel, is that correct?
Yes, people can just jot down your questions. We'll open up the Q&A at the end and be addressing all of them then. Yes, we are going to transition into Josh's talk in just a second. I have one more survey question, just kind of as a follow-up to some of the things you were talking about, Gavin, with hydrogen sulfide measurements. So we would just like to know what the general interest is in the ability to measure hydrogen sulfide in the winery, if anyone is already doing that, and perhaps what some of the obstacles might be to those types of measurements right now amongst producers and dabblers. Okay, I'm just going to give it 5 seconds. Okay, so we can see that about 10% of people are already doing some hydrogen sulfide measurements in the winery, but we also do have almost about 40% of people who are interested, but there are some limitations right now, and so that's exciting for us. Definitely look for our extension publication on a easily adaptable method for inexpensive hydrogen sulfide measurements in the winery as a tool for winemakers that we're hoping to make available. So thank you, Gavin, for
Rachel,
presentation.
I was just taking a quick look at the Q&A. There's a bunch of questions already, I think that I know this is like an hour seminar, and I've got some time to stick around afterwards for questions, so there should be enough time for both Josh and I to address those.
Okay, sounds good. Okay, so again, thank you for the presentation, Gavin. I think we're going to transition to Josh's talk. And I will just introduce him for you. So Joshua currently works in the technical department for Enartis USA as a winemaking specialist. The graduate of Enology and Viticulture from UC Davis, Joshua utilizes his production and lab experience to host educational webinars on topics such as wine stabilization, sensory improvement, and product application. His work in the wine industry focuses on analysis and winemaking techniques for quality improvement. So I'm going to turn it over to Joshua.
Thanks, Rachel, and thank you, Gavin, for that awesome presentation on SO2. I think the work you guys have done is really, really interesting, and I can't wait to see what other findings that you guys have. I think it's super important for canned wine, and I think it's really exciting work that you're doing. So my presentation, I'm going to try to go through a lot of information pretty quickly. It's mostly going to be focused on looking at how we can make wines with less SO2. Mostly because of the reasons that Gavin pointed out in his presentation. If we're going to look at canning wines and we're seeing that the effect of SO2 is having negative consequences in terms of formation of reductive compounds, we might want to look at ways that we can lower SO2 levels throughout the process, and also look at ways that we can lower them before we go into the can as well. So just sort of a brief overview, I'm going to talk about lowering SO2 levels first. And then I'm going to talk about two activities of SO2, the antioxidant effect of SO2, and also the antimicrobial aspect. And then finally, I'll briefly go over some trials and results that we have sort of compiled over the last year and a half or so of working with canned wines and ciders. So low SO2 winemaking, if we want to make wines with lower SO2, we need to first understand what are the activities of SO2. We need to know what it's doing in wine so that we can actually, if we're going to lower the levels of SO2, what we can do is we can replace the activities of SO2. Another thing that we need to do if we're going to make wines with lower SO2 is we need to reduce the SO2 losses. So how much SO2 we lose over the process and during packaging. And then also what we need to do is, reduce the actual SO2 additions at packaging. And that's something that we will, we will talk about more in just a couple of slides. So lowering SO2 starts at harvest. We add SO2 at a lot of different points in the process, but at harvest, when we receive grapes, we will add SO2 at that point. We add SO2 to must before they go into the press. We add SO2 at clarification stages sometimes. We usually avoid adding SO2 during fermentation. We'll typically add SO2 after fermentation, either before or after MLF, and then over aging, and then sometimes, just prior to packaging as well. So there's a lot of different points where we can add SO2. Sorry, 1 second. Gavin, do you mind turning off your microphone? I think your microphone is on now. Thank you. So getting back to the different points that we add SO2 during the process, we need to think about these different points and think about the activities at these different points and how we can replace those activities. So here are the three main activities that SO2 contributes to wine. We have antioxidant activity, which is involved with chemical oxidation. We have antimicrobial activity, which is involved with microbial control. And then we have antioxidasic activity, which is enzymatic oxidation that occurs during harvest and also in the juice phase. And that's more involved with enzymes, specifically in the juice. I'm going to mostly focus on antioxidant and antimicrobial effects of SO2. And first, I'll talk about the antioxidant effect. So this is a scheme for chemical oxidation. This was proposed by John Danilovich in 2007. He wrote a really nice paper on the interaction of sulfur dioxide, polyphenols, oxygen, and metals in wine. So when we look at this sort of mechanism, what we can see is that oxygen comes into wine. It interacts with copper, which interacts with iron. That iron then interacts with polyphenols, and those polyphenols become a byproduct called quinone. That quinone can then go on to interact with bisulfite, and so that's one of the interactions of sulfite in the sort of oxidation reactions. On the other side of it, through the process of oxidation, we form peroxide, which forms acetaldehyde. That acetaldehyde can bind to bisulfite, forming sulfate. So that's two different sort of ways that sulfite is interacting in terms of oxidation. We lose bisulfite by the formation of acetaldehyde, and we also reverse the reaction of oxidation with sulfite as well. In this same mechanism, we have different things that are players. So we have oxygen, we have metals, which are copper and iron primarily, and we have phenolics in the form of diphenols. So I'm going to sort of highlight those three different variables and talk about how we can effectively mitigate oxidation, or this mechanism of oxidation, by controlling those three different parameters. So firstly, we'll focus on the metals effect. So in that same paper, John Danilovich did a really nice sort of experiment to show the effects of iron and copper in terms of oxidation and loss of free SO2. So over on the right-hand side, you'll see this little chart here that shows a lot of different lines. What he did in this experiment is he created a model wine with some phenolics in it, some catechol, and he added different amounts of copper and iron to that wine, or to that model wine, and basically saturated that model wine with oxygen. And then what he did is he measured the amount of loss of free SO2. He also added 100 parts of SO2 to that same solution, and he basically tracked the loss of free SO2 in those different treatments. And basically what he was able to show is that if you look at the line A, you'll see that that line had no iron or copper added to it. He added to another separate model wine 0.15 milligrams per liter of copper, and saw an increase in the amount of loss of free SO2. He also added to another one, which is the C line, um, a little bit of iron with no copper, and he saw just about the same effect as the copper on its own. He increased the concentration of iron and saw a very similar effect. But then when he added a small amount of iron and a very small amount of copper, he saw a big jump in the depreciation of free SO2. So this shows basically the interaction of copper and iron and their effects on oxidation. Then what he also saw was with a very negligible increase in copper at zero point 0.1 milligrams per liter, there was actually a huge effect in terms of the loss of free SO2. So we can see that even small amounts and increases in copper can have a dramatic effect on the oxidation or the ability of a product to oxidize. So what this points to is the importance of the metals in terms of their ability to increase the rates of oxidation and increase in the loss of free SO2 as well. So if we want to preserve our free SO2 for longer, if we want to prevent our wines from oxidizing more quickly, we might think about potentially removing those metals in order to limit that oxidation reaction from happening. One way that we can do this is with metal removers. So if you watched the previous webinar that we did on part 1, you probably are familiar with these already, but I'll just quickly introduce them again. So these are two enological tools that are available to winemakers right now that can remove metals from wine. In particular, copper and iron, but also copper that is bound to hydrogen sulfide. So PVI PVP is a polymer that is specific for removing copper and iron. It also removes smaller phenolics, which I'll talk about in a couple more minutes, can be beneficial for limiting oxidation as well. So it's a super useful tool in terms of getting metals out of the wine. Another enological tool is chitosan. So chitosan is typically thought of as an antimicrobial agent, but we can actually process chitosan in such a way to actually increase its effects for removing copper. And then in particular, we have a version of a special version of chitosan that's called pre-activated chitosan, in which we basically form a chitosan that is a higher charge density, and so it is more reactive and able to react more with metals and remove metals as well. So these are sort of two different enological tools that are currently available for removing metals. And so if we were to think about different points in the process where we can remove metals in fermentation. So during fermentation, we have some metal absorption by yeast, but we also have metals that carry over into the subsequent wine as well. And that's actually a good opportunity to remove metals because it's early in the process. And so if we think about a wine's susceptibility to oxidation, during the fermentation, wines usually have a limited amount of susceptibility to oxidation, but after fermentation, that's when the wine is subjected to oxidation. So if we remove the metals early in the process, that means that the wine is basically less susceptible to oxidation further on down in aging. So this is a good opportunity to remove the metals. We can conversely remove the metals during aging and also prior to canning. So at any point during the winemaking phase, we can also remove metals during that time, during aging or just prior to packaging. The advantage here is that if we, let's say, form some reduction during fermentation and we want to alleviate it with some copper sulfate, when we treat with the copper sulfate, we can subsequently remove that copper the copper and the copper that's bound to the hydrogen sulfide with either the PVI PVP or the chitosan during the aging phase or just prior to canning. So again, if you haven't watched part 1 of canning, I highly recommend checking that out, because that will help clear up some of these concepts in terms of removing copper and the role of copper and copper-bound sulfides in canning. So I'm just going to introduce to you some different metal removing options that Enartis provides to the industry. In the form of Pro XP and Pro FT, these are polysaccharide blends that contain PVI PVP. So these are yeast derivatives essentially that have PVI PVP in the blend. So this is something that not only increases mouthfeel and increases antioxidant capacity by removing metals. Also, the Pro FT is a version that has a little bit of sulfur peptides, which increases the antioxidant effect of the product as well. So we have 2 versions of PVI PVP containing products for fermentation, and that's the Pro XP and Pro FT. Post fermentation is when we would use something like Claryl HM or Stable Met, which is the Claryl HM is a blend of the chitosan I mentioned before and PVI PVP. And the Stable Met is just the pure version of PVI PVP and silica. So if we were to think about the different stages in winemaking, again, where we want to remove metals, during fermentation, we would use the Pro XP or the Pro FT. The convective action of the fermentation is actually a really good opportunity to add this kind of metal remover as well, because basically the fermentation is already mixing. And so by using this polysaccharide with the PVI PVP in the blend, you're removing those metals during fermentation while it's already mixing. So it's a really good opportunity to use that product there. But then also we can use something like Claryl HM anytime during aging or just prior to canning as well. And this is just a trial that we did to look at the impact of the Pro FT, the fermentation polysaccharide blend that I mentioned before, in terms of its effect on reducing oxidative tendency. And so what we did is we had the same batch that was separated in 2 different tanks. One was treated with a Pro FT during fermentation, one was not. And then what we did is we measured the oxidative stability of the product, which means that we heated up to 50 degrees and incubate it over the course of 3 days, and measure the change in absorbance at 420, which is basically the amount of browning that happens. And you can see on the right, this is the image of the products after the heating, and you can see that there's a big difference between the Pro FT treated compared to the control in terms of browning. So this is just one more additional piece of information that gives us sort of confidence in using this for limiting oxidative tendencies of wines. So moving on to the next sort of piece of that mechanism that John Danilovich elaborated in his paper, which is looking at the role of phenolics on the losses of SO2. And so typically we think of tannins and certain phenolics as being antioxidant, but in some cases they can actually be pro-oxidants, because they're part of the whole mechanism of oxidation in wine. And so when we look at the role of phenolics, what John did in his experiments is he looked at varying concentrations of these phenolics in model wine, and how that varying concentration affected the loss in free SO2. And basically what he saw was that when he added oxygen to a model wine that had a little bit of copper and iron in it and free SO2, what he saw was that the increasing concentration of phenolics actually sped up the loss of free SO2. So this is another place that we can kind of try and intervene with the oxidation process, is by removing some of those phenolics, we can actually slow down some of those oxidative processes. And so there's many different ways that we can do that. How do we decrease the oxidative precursors in the wine? So one way that we can do it is with PVPP, as in our stable PVPP. If you look over on the right, you can see this is a trial that we did looking at the role of PVPP in removing catechin. So catechin is a monomeric phenolic compound that can be oxidized very easily in wine or in juice. And what we did is we treated a wine with 12 grams per hectoliter of PVPP and 20 grams per hectoliter of PVPP. and we noted the decrease in catechin content. And so you're able to substantially decrease the amount of catechin or monomeric um, phenolics with something like PVPP. There's also another product in our SLI range, which is our shelf life improvement range, called Stab SLI, and that is a PVPP containing product with yeast holes and also an antioxidant tannin. And that's typically used during aging for preventing oxidation in low SO2 wines. And we can see with the use of that product as well, we can decrease the amount of catechin content. So there's a few different options in terms of removing those catechins. Also, PVI PVP, the one that removes the metals, is also able to remove some of these monomeric phenolics as well. So that helps with further slowing down the oxidative process. Again, polymer blends like Claryl HM can do the same thing. Chitosan has some capacity to remove catechins and monomeric phenolics. Casein, which is also known as potassium caseinate or protoclar, can also remove some of those compounds that are able to oxidize. Hyperoxidation is a tool that's used in the juice phase typically in juices that have no SO2, and that involves more enzymatic activity as well as oxygen um, um, oxidation by chemical reaction. But hyperoxidation does not typically work well for a lot of aromatic varieties, so it's one tool that winemakers can use for limiting some of these precursors as well. And then separating hard press fractions can be helpful as well. So the harder you press on a white must, the more phenolics you get out. And so separating off some of the hard press fractions and treating those separately can sometimes help limit those precursors as well. So we've talked about some of the different pieces of this mechanism for oxidation, but probably one of the most important is the oxygen ingress, or how much oxygen we're getting into the samples as well. And so this is a collection of ranges found in different studies looking at the pickup of oxygen in the winemaking process. And so we can see, I've highlighted in pink here some of the biggest ranges in terms of oxygen pickup in the process. We can see that cross-flow filtration, membrane filtration are both points where we can pick up a significant amount of oxygen. And you can see there's a fairly large range, which is what we would expect, that some wineries are much better at controlling oxygen and are much more careful about how much oxygen they pick up in these processes, where some wineries might be a little bit more lenient and not be as attentive to it. I do want to note the cold stabilization factor here has one of the largest ranges. And this is something that winemakers can completely cut out of their process if they use like an additive solution like Zenith or like CMC. We can basically completely cut out that bit of oxygen pickup in the process by utilizing an additive solution rather than the traditional cold stabilization. So with cold stabilization, you lower the temperatures of the wine, you increase the susceptibility of that wine to oxidation by pickup of oxygen because the wine is able to absorb more oxygen. So cold stabilization is something that we can actually think of as a means to lower our SO2 loss as well if we were to cut that out of the process. Electrodialysis, we can contribute some oxygen in that process. And then bottling is obviously, there's a huge variability in terms of how much oxygen we pick up. And so control of that process is really, really important, specifically for canning as well. If we're going to be lowering the SO2 levels, we really need to be very, very careful about how much oxygen pickup we have during that phase of the process. So if you're not tightly controlling oxygen pickup in your canning process at this point, if you're lowering the SO2 levels, that's certainly going to be a bigger concern. So now I'll just talk about the antimicrobial effect briefly of SO2. So again, these are different points that we add SO2 for microbial protection in the winemaking process. We add it to the grapes typically early on, especially if they have some botrytis or some kind of bunch rot or anything like that. We want to make sure that we're protecting the fruit from microbial populations. During pressing, potentially during clarification. We typically avoid it during fermentation for good reasons. One, yeast don't typically want to have extra SO2 in solution, but two, it can also contribute to reduction and things like that. So it's typically not necessary during fermentation. We typically don't add it to that point either. Just after fermentation, we might add it if we want to avoid malolactic fermentation, or we might add it after MLF throughout the course of aging and just prior to packaging. So there's a lot of different points where we are adding SO2 to protect the wine. And so one thing that we need to think about is if we're trying to lower our SO2 levels, how can we do that feasibly throughout all of the different phases of the winemaking process? And that's where I think a tool like chitosan becomes extremely useful in the winemaking process for low SO2 wines. So if you're not familiar with chitosan, chitosan is a polysaccharide that's derived from a specific fungus called Aspergillus niger. And it's a polysaccharide that is processed in such a way that it basically there's a deacetylation step of chitin, and it produces chitosan. Chitosan specifically is an antimicrobial compound, but we basically take a form of chitosan and we increase the charge density and make it much more active. And that's what Stab Micro is. Stab Micro is a chitosan that is a pre-activated chitosan. So if you look at this image right here, you'll see what a typical standard chitosan looks like. And we go through a grinding and acidification step that essentially increases the charge density and makes the chitosan more active. And so chitosan, what it does is it binds to the surface of the microbes and disrupts the cell membrane and basically kills the cell. And so you can see here this image that looks like a sort of asteroid with all these little things attached to it. That's actually the chitosan itself with the microbes that are attached to the surface of it. That's Brettanomyces that's stuck to it. So it's a really useful tool because it reduces microbial populations in wine and actually can work on a lot of different kinds of microbes. So there's two different versions of it. There's Stab Micro M, which is used. So the M is for must. That's what's used during fermentation in juices and early in the winemaking process. Stab Micro is a blend that's used basically in clear wines or wines that are aging. And so Stab Micro works basically on nearly every spoilage microorganism. It works on Brettanomyces, Lactobacillus, Pediococcus, Acetobacter, Zygosaccharomyces. And so it's really effective at removing populations. And through that, in combination with low amounts of SO2, I think you can produce a wine with much lower SO2 levels. So with the addition of the chitosan, you can reduce the populations of the bacteria or the yeast, and then you can control growth with a small amount of SO2 in aging. And so malolactic fermentation can be inhibited with the use of Stab Micro. If you use a really high dosage of it, you can actually inhibit the malolactic fermentation. If you use a lower dose of it, you can actually still go through malolactic fermentation without any problems. There are different points where we can add Stab Micro. You can be added in pretty much any point in the wine production process. It can be added to grapes, to freshly pressed juices as a clarifying agent in before fermentation. It can be added during fermentation and at any point during aging. So it's really can be used at any point during the process. The only thing that needs to be covered is the packaging itself. And so at packaging, we need to either use something like Velcorin or definitely sterile filtration can help with that as well. But we definitely need to have something that is going to help with microbes during the actual packaging itself. And so that's where tools like Velcorin become really useful and sterile filtration. But leading up to canning, we can keep our wine very stable with the use of chitosan or Stab Micro. And this is just an example of a no SO2 wine that a protocol that we put together for a client, where we essentially had the same wine treated with our no SO2 protocol and their typical protocol with SO2. And you can see the comparison between the free SO2 is 0 in the low SO2 protocol compared to their typical protocol. And the VA was actually lower in the low SO2 protocol compared to the added SO2. And there was less microbial contamination, no Pediococcus, Lactobacillus, Zygosaccharomyces, or Brettanomyces in the no SO2 protocol, whereas the added SO2 actually had a population of Lactobacillus. You can see the color differences between the two different products as well. The low SO2 actually had much darker color than the added SO2, and that's probably from bisulfite bleaching. So keeping all of the things keeping all of the things in mind that I just spoke about, we did some further testing in collaboration with UC Davis. Corinne Rich, who was a PhD student, did all of these great experiments with us. And what we did is we did some accelerated aging tests looking at the use of our products And specifically, this was a Riesling that we had treated with stable met and also with Stab Micro. And we subjected it to 8 weeks of accelerated aging, and then looked at the increase of acetaldehyde in those three different treatments. What we found was that the Stab Micro improved the reduction of acetaldehyde increase. So basically, there's less acetaldehyde produced out of a wine treated with Stab Micro. And the stable met had a significant impact on reducing the acetaldehyde production compared to the control. So this is just more evidence that basically the stable met or PBI PBP can be a really good tool for reducing the acetaldehyde increases in wines that are undergoing oxidation. Similarly, we looked at the increase in 420 or the increase in browning in those same wines. And what we found was a similar trend. Stab Micro had an added benefit of decreasing the amount of browning, and stable met had a significant impact on reducing the amount of browning in that Riesling. Another trial that we just completed this last year in collaboration with a cidery was to look at the impact of a protocol on cider and packaging and canned packaging. And so this was work that was done by Matt Wilson, our cider expert, in collaboration with one of our clients. And what they looked at was a protocol that involved a fermented cider with Stab Micro. So they used Stab Micro M at 10 grams per hectoliter in the fermentation. And then they treated that subsequent cider with 0.1 ppm of copper and then added Clairol HM to remove that copper. So we added copper to deal with sulfides post-fermentation, and then we removed it with Clairol HM. And they canned that product with 0 ppm of SO2. So that was a no SO2 protocol. The same batch was fermented without Stab Micro M. It was treated with 0.1 ppm of copper, and then no Clairol HM was added, so it retained that residual level of copper. And then that was canned with 35 ppm of free SO2. Then what we did is we tracked over time the evolution of aluminum in those products. And what we saw was that in the no SO2 protocol, we saw a significant decrease in the amount of aluminum evolved, which makes sense based off of what we saw with Gavin's presentation, that we had less SO2 reacting with aluminum and less aluminum oxide produced and leaching into the product. So less aluminum produced over the course of the aging period, about half the amount that was produced by the added SO2 product. We also measured the H2S evolution over time using a similar method that Gavin talked about with the GDT tubes. And what we saw was that there was a decent increase of H2S, well above threshold limits at 2 micrograms per liter. We saw about 3.6 or 3.7 micrograms per liter of H2S over time, where the no SO2 had non-detect levels of H2S over the course of that aging period. So again, just more evidence of the impact of SO2 on the formation of H2S in the canned packaging. Now, this cider trial, we did learn about the H2S evolution, but I should mention that there was a slight amount of oxidation that occurred over the course of the aging as well. So probably what we'll do is we'll do follow-up trials looking at very small amounts of SO2, just enough to capture any acetaldehyde that might be produced and also prevent any excess browning from occurring. So we learned a lot, I think, in terms of reducing the H2S, but now it's, I think, a matter of finding the balance of how much SO2 is actually needed and how much can be feasibly added without increasing too much the H2S production. So here's some takeaways from my presentation. Limiting SO2 can help with reduction appearing in the canned products. Understanding the activities of SO2 can help us find ways to lower levels in canned wine production, and that there's good evidence of that low SO2 and removing copper can really help with reduction in canned products. And so that's it. That's it on my presentation. I'm going to go